The whisper of Eterna. The jungle was alive with the sounds of unseen creatures, their calls echoing through the dense canopy. Kale moved silently, his boots sinking into the soft, moss-covered ground. The air was thick with humidity, and the scent of damp earth filled his nostrils. He had been searching for this place for years, following cryptic clues and ancient maps. Now, he stood at the edge of a clearing, his heart pounding with anticipation. Before him rose the Temple of Eterna, its stone walls covered in vines and moss. The structure was massive, its towering spires reaching toward the sky. Kale felt a shiver run down his spine as he approached the entrance. The air seemed to hum with energy, as if the temple itself was alive. He stepped inside, the cool darkness enveloping him. His flashlight cut through the shadows, revealing intricate carvings on the walls. They depicted a woman with flowing hair and eyes that seemed to follow him as he moved. The carvings told a story of a powerful warrior, a goddess who had been betrayed and imprisoned by her enemies. Kale's breath caught in his throat as he entered the central chamber. There, in the center of the room, stood a statue of the woman from the carvings. She was breathtakingly beautiful, her features carved with such detail that she seemed almost alive. In her chest was a glowing crystal, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. He approached the statue, his hand reaching out to touch the crystal. As his fingers brushed against it, a voice echoed in his mind. "Speak my name," it whispered, soft and seductive. Kale hesitated, his heart racing. He didn't know her name, but the word came to him as if it had always been there. "Eterna," he whispered. The moment the name left his lips, the statue began to crack. Kale stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock. The stone fell away, revealing smooth, glowing skin beneath. The woman stepped down from the pedestal, her emerald eyes locking onto his. She was even more beautiful in person, her presence commanding and otherworldly. "You have awakened me," she said, her voice like music. "I am Eterna, and you are my chosen one." Kale's mind raced. He had heard stories of ancient gods and goddesses, but he had never believed them to be real. Yet here she was, standing before him, her power radiating like a star. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eterna smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "Because you are the one who spoke my name. You are the one who broke the curse. And now, you are mine." Kale felt a strange pull toward her, a connection that went beyond words. He knew his life would never be the same. As they left the temple, the jungle seemed to come alive around them. The air was charged with energy, and Kale could feel the weight of Eterna's gaze on him. She moved with grace and confidence, her every step radiating power. "Where are we going?" he asked, struggling to keep up with her. "To reclaim what is mine," she replied, her voice firm. "But first, we must prepare. My enemies will not rest until I am imprisoned once more." Kale nodded, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. He had come to the temple seeking answers, but he had found something far greater. He had found Eterna, and with her, a destiny he could never have imagined. As they walked, Eterna reached out and took his hand. Her touch sent a jolt of electricity through him, and he felt a surge of warmth in his chest. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of desire and determination. "You are mine now, Kale," she said softly. "And I will protect you, as you have protected me." Kale didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same. The bond of fire and stars. The jungle was alive with danger. The moment Eterna stepped out of the temple, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Kale stumbled, catching himself on a nearby tree as the earth shook violently. The air grew heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "What's happening?" Kale shouted over the growing roar of the jungle. Eterna's eyes glowed with a fierce light as she turned to face the temple. "The Guardians," she said, her voice calm but laced with urgency. "They have sensed my awakening. They will not let me leave. Before Kale could respond, the temple's massive stone doors slammed shut with a deafening crash. From the shadows, figures began to emerge, tall, armored beings made of stone, their eyes glowing with a menacing red light. They moved with unnatural speed, their heavy footsteps cracking the ground beneath them. "Run," Eterna commanded, grabbing Kale's hand. Her touch sent a surge of energy through him, and suddenly, he felt lighter, faster. They sprinted through the jungle, the stone guardians close behind. The trees seemed to part for them, as if the jungle itself was aiding their escape. Kale glanced back, his heart pounding as he saw the guardians gaining ground. "They're too fast," he yelled. Eterna stopped abruptly, turning to face their pursuers. Her expression was calm, almost serene, as she raised her hand. The air around her shimmered, and a wave of energy burst forth, slamming into the guardians. The force of it sent them flying backward, their stone bodies cracking and crumbling as they hit the ground. Kale stared in awe. "How did you?" "There's no time," Eterna interrupted, her voice firm. "More will come. We must keep moving." They ran until the jungle gave way to a clearing, where the sky opened up above them. The twin suns of the planet were setting, casting the landscape in hues of orange and purple. Eterna slowed to a stop, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Kale, on the other hand, was gasping for air, his legs trembling from the exertion. "You're not even winded," he said between breaths, looking at her with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Eterna smiled, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "I am not bound by the same limitations as you, Kale. But do not worry, you will grow stronger in time." Kale wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had always considered himself in good shape, but compared to her, he felt like a child. As the suns dipped below the horizon, the jungle grew quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Eterna sat down on a large rock, her gaze fixed on the stars above. Kale joined her, sitting a respectful distance away. "Who were those things back there?" he asked, breaking the silence. "The guardians," Eterna replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "They were created to protect the temple, and to ensure I never escaped. My enemies knew I would one day awaken, and they prepared for it." "Your enemies," Kale repeated. "Who are they?" Eterna turned to him, her emerald eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "They call themselves the Shadow Imperium now, but they were once my people. I ruled over them, united them, and they betrayed me. They feared my power, so they sealed me away, hoping to erase me from history." Kale frowned. "Why would they fear you?" "You're incredible." Eterna's lips curved into a small smile. "Power can be both a blessing and a curse, Kale. I was too powerful, too ambitious. They saw me as a threat, and so they cast me aside." There was a long pause as Kale processed her words. He couldn't imagine anyone betraying someone like her. She was strength and beauty personified, a force of nature that demanded respect. "What happens now?" he asked finally. "Now," Eterna said, standing and extending her hand to him, "we prepare. The Shadow Imperium will come for me, and when they do, we must be ready. But first, we rest." Kale took her hand, and she pulled him to his feet. Her touch was warm, comforting, and he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. They made camp under the stars, the fire Eterna conjured with a flick of her wrist casting a warm glow over them. Kale watched her as she sat across from him, her face illuminated by the flames. She was mesmerizing, her every movement graceful and deliberate. "You're staring," she said without looking at him, a playful smile tugging at her lips. Kale felt his face heat up. "Sorry. It's just, you're unlike anyone I've ever met." Eterna's smile widened, and she leaned closer to him. "And you, Kale, are unlike anyone I've ever known. You awakened me, freed me from my prison. That makes you special." Kale's heart raced as she reached out, her fingers brushing against his cheek. Her touch was electric, sending a shiver down his spine. "You're mine now," she whispered, her voice low and filled with promise. "And I will protect you, no matter what." Kale didn't know what to say. He had never been one for grand declarations or romantic gestures, but with Eterna, it felt natural. He leaned into her touch, his eyes never leaving hers. The night stretched on, the fire crackling softly as they sat together, their bond growing stronger with each passing moment. Kale knew their journey would be fraught with danger, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he had a purpose. And as Eterna's lips met his in a kiss that set his soul on fire, he knew he would follow her to the ends of the galaxy. The Trials of Unity. The moon of Celestra loomed before them, its surface bathed in the soft glow of a nearby nebula. Kale stood at the viewport of his ship, the Starblade, his eyes fixed on the ancient temple complex that dominated the landscape. The structures were massive, their spires reaching toward the heavens like the fingers of a sleeping giant. "This is it," Eterna said, her voice soft but filled with determination. "The Temple of Celestial Union. Here, we will complete the bonding ritual." Kale turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Bonding ritual? You didn't mention that before." Eterna smiled, her emerald eyes glowing with a warmth that made his heart skip a beat. "It is necessary, Kale. The ritual will strengthen our connection, allowing us to share thoughts, emotions, and even strength. It will make us one in ways you cannot yet imagine." Kale swallowed hard. The idea of being so deeply connected to someone, especially someone as powerful as Eterna, was both thrilling and terrifying. "What do we have to do?" "Trust me," she said simply, placing a hand on his chest. Her touch sent a wave of calm through him, easing his nerves. "That is all you need to do." They landed the ship in a clearing near the temple, the ancient stones glowing faintly in the moonlight. As they approached the entrance, Kale felt a strange pull, as if the temple itself was calling to him. The air was thick with energy, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to hum with power. Inside, the temple was even more breathtaking. The walls were covered in intricate carvings that depicted scenes of unity and love, of two beings becoming one. At the center of the chamber was a raised dais, its surface etched with glowing runes. "This is where we will perform the ritual," Eterna said, leading him to the dais. "Stand here, beside me." Kale did as she instructed, his heart pounding in his chest. Eterna took his hands in hers, her touch warm and reassuring. "Close your eyes," she whispered. "And let go of your fears." Kale obeyed, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. As he did, he felt a surge of energy flow through him, starting from where Eterna's hands touched his and spreading throughout his body. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a warmth that filled him completely, leaving no room for doubt or fear. "Kale," Eterna's voice echoed in his mind, soft and soothing. "Open yourself to me." He did, and suddenly, he was no longer in the temple. He stood in a vast, starry expanse, the cosmos stretching out around him in every direction. Eterna stood before him, her form glowing with a radiant light. "This is the essence of the ritual," she said, her voice resonating in his mind. "We will face trials here, challenges that will test our bond. But if we succeed, we will emerge stronger than ever." Kale nodded, his determination growing. "I'm ready." The first trial began almost immediately. The stars around them shifted, forming a swirling vortex of light and shadow. From the vortex emerged a figure, a dark, twisted version of Kale himself. "This is your fear," Eterna explained. "Your doubts, your insecurities. You must face them." Kale stared at the figure, his heart racing. It was like looking into a mirror, but one that reflected all the parts of himself he tried to hide. The dark Kale sneered at him, his eyes filled with malice. "You're not good enough for her," the figure taunted. "You're just a man. She's a goddess. What can you possibly offer her?" Kale clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "I may not be a goddess," he said, his voice steady. But I'm strong. I'm loyal. And I'll do whatever it takes to protect her. The dark Kale laughed, a harsh, grating sound, empty words. You'll fail her, just like you've failed everyone else. Kale felt a surge of anger, but before he could react, Eterna stepped forward. Enough, she said, her voice firm. This is not who he is. She raised her hand, and a wave of light burst forth, engulfing the dark figure. It screamed, its form dissolving into nothingness. Kale watched in awe as the light faded, leaving only the stars behind. You faced your fear, Eterna said, turning to him with a smile. That is the first step. The second trial was more intense. The starry expanse shifted again, this time forming a battlefield. Armies clashed around them, the sounds of war filling the air. This is my fear, Eterna said, her voice tinged with sadness. The betrayal of my people, the war that tore my empire apart. I must face it, and you must stand with me. Kale nodded, his resolve unwavering. I'm with you, Eterna. Always. They fought side by side, their movements perfectly synchronized. Kale felt a surge of power flowing through him, as if Eterna's strength was his own. Together, they cut through the enemy forces, their bond growing stronger with each passing moment. When the battle was over, Eterna turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. You stood by me, she said softly. Even in my darkest moment. Kale reached out, taking her hand in his. I told you, I'm with you. No matter what. The final trial was the most challenging. The stars around them faded, leaving only darkness. From the shadows emerged a figure, a man with cold, calculating eyes. Cassus, Eterna whispered, her voice filled with pain. The one who betrayed me. The man smiled, a cruel, mocking expression. You thought you could escape, Eterna? You thought you could rebuild what you lost? You're a fool. Kale stepped forward, his anger flaring. You don't get to talk to her like that. Cassus turned to him, his eyes narrowing. And who are you? A mere mortal, thinking he can stand against me? Kale didn't back down. I'm the one who awakened her. I'm the one who stands by her side. And I'm not afraid of you. Cassus laughed, but before he could respond, Eterna stepped forward. This ends now, she said, her voice filled with power. She raised her hand, and a burst of light engulfed Cassus, his form dissolving into nothingness. The darkness around them faded, replaced by the warm glow of the temple. Kale opened his eyes, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was back in the temple, Eterna's hands still holding his. It's done, she said, her voice filled with relief. The trials are complete. Our bond is sealed. Kale felt a surge of warmth in his chest, a connection to Eterna that went beyond words. He could feel her emotions, her thoughts, as if they were his own. Eterna, he whispered, his voice filled with awe. She smiled, her eyes glowing with love. We are one now, Kale. And together, we will face whatever comes next. The War of Shadows. The Starblade hurtled through hyperspace, its engines humming with a steady rhythm. Kale sat in the pilot's seat, his hands gripping the controls as he navigated the ship toward their destination. Beside him, Eterna gazed out at the swirling colors of hyperspace, her expression calm but focused. We're approaching the rebel base, Kale said, breaking the silence. Are you sure we can trust them? Eterna turned to him, her emerald eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the cockpit. We have no choice, Kale. The Shadow Imperium is too powerful for us to face alone. We need allies. Kale nodded, though a part of him still felt uneasy. He had spent most of his life avoiding entanglements with factions and governments, preferring to work alone. But this was different. This was about survival, and about protecting Eterna. The ship emerged from hyperspace, the rebel base coming into view. It was a massive space station, its surface covered in weapons and defensive systems. As they approached, a voice crackled over the comms. "Unidentified vessel, state your business." Kale glanced at Eterna, who gave him a reassuring nod. "This is Kale, captain of the Star Blade. We're here to speak with your leader. We have information about the Shadow Imperium." There was a pause, followed by a curt reply. "Stand by for docking instructions." The Starblade was guided into a hangar bay, where a group of armed rebels awaited them. Kale and Eterna stepped off the ship, their hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm Kale," he said, addressing the leader of the group, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek. "This is Eterna. We need to speak with your leader." The man studied them for a moment before nodding. "Follow me." They were led through the station, the corridors bustling with activity. Rebels moved about with purpose, their faces set with determination. Kale couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for them. They were fighting against impossible odds, just like he was. They were brought to a large command center, where a woman stood at the center of a holographic map of the galaxy. She turned as they entered, her sharp eyes taking them in. "I'm Commander Lyra," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You have information about the Shadow Imperium?" "We do," Eterna replied, stepping forward. "But we also need your help. The Imperium is hunting us, and we cannot face them alone." Lyra raised an eyebrow. "And why should we help you? What makes you so important?" Eterna's eyes glowed with a fierce light as she extended her hand. A small orb of energy formed in her palm, its light filling the room. "Because I am Eterna, the Jade Empress. And I have the power to destroy the Imperium." The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on Eterna. Lyra stared at her for a long moment before nodding. "All right. You've got our attention. Let's talk." Over the next few hours, Kale and Eterna explained their situation to the rebel leaders. They spoke of Eterna's past, of the betrayal that had led to her imprisonment, and of the Shadow Imperium's plans to reclaim her power. The rebels listened intently, their expressions growing more serious with each passing moment. "If what you're saying is true," Lyra said finally, "then we have a common enemy. But the Imperium is strong. Taking them down won't be easy." "We know," Kale said. "But with your help, we can do it. Together, we can strike a blow that will weaken them, maybe even destroy them." Lyra studied them for a moment before nodding. "All right. We're in. But this won't be a simple mission. We'll need to plan carefully." The rebels began to strategize, their voices filled with determination. Kale watched as Eterna spoke with Lyra, her presence commanding respect and admiration. He felt a surge of pride, knowing that he was by her side. As the planning continued, Kale found himself thinking about the challenges ahead. The Shadow Imperium was a formidable foe, but with Eterna and the rebels by his side, he felt a glimmer of hope. "Kale," Eterna's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "Are you ready for this?" He looked into her eyes, seeing the strength and determination there. "I'm ready," he said firmly. "For you, I'd face anything." Eterna smiled, her touch sending a wave of warmth through him. "Then let's show the Imperium what we're made of."